Audiobook Always Visible, Another Prayer for the Dying Horror Genre, by Vitaly Ivolginsky. Based on the motion picture Omen IV, The Awakening. 7th chapter. Not knowing what to do, the inspector grabbed the last obvious opportunity for him. Do you have close friends or classmates? He turned to Delia. For some reason the girl was confused by this question. Her cheeks flushed red and she looked down. Galbraith was not a psychologist, but this reaction made him think that the girl was clearly in love with one of her schoolfellows. Finally she decided to answer. No, little girl said briefly and clearly. Nothing at all? Okay, not close ones, just your acquaintances? Really, no. Delia's face suddenly sharpened and took on an expression of dissatisfaction. She even stomped her foot. Okay Delia, I get it, Galbraith answered in a soothing tone. Then he stretched out to his full height and turned to the doctor. Well, this isn't good. Apparently, the guardianship authorities will have to be involved in this matter. Don't look so glum. We have not yet made a request to search for her relatives. The young lady may not have known her parents' cousins or second cousins by sight, but this does not mean that she is alone in this world. You're an optimist, Matt, I've always liked that about you, but here's a case. All is not lost, Mr. Inspector. Suit yourself. But still, where should we place her until the circumstances are clarified? You can talk to that woman, the witness. They, it seemed to me, knew each other well. Nice idea, thought Galbraith, but where did it go? The inspector walked to the exit of the house and shouted to the young sergeant who was standing in the yard at the gate. Sergeant Sausher, don't you know where that woman went? Which one, Mr. Inspector? Well, with a scarf on her head. You mean Elspeth Roselew? She went out the gate and the trail went cold. Yes, couldn't be better. Galbraith turned back, but Delia was not in the hall. Matt, where's the baby? He asked the doctor. The girl went upstairs. Said she wanted to change clothes. All right. I'll go away for now. Having said this, Galbraith entered the bathroom, which combined both a bathtub and a toilet. Having done his dirty work, he washed his hands and went back out. During the time that the inspector spent in the bath, Delia had already made her way down to the hall and was now standing next to the mirror. Matt spoke the truth. A baby girl changed her dress, and was now wearing blue pants and a beige jacket with a zipper, under which a pink shirt was visible. Where you're headed, if it's not indiscreet, Galbraith was a little surprised by her change of clothes. The girl, putting the comb on the bedside table, turned away from the mirror and looked at Mann with some surprise. Am I not coming with you? She asked, shaking her head. Well, you know, the inspector hesitated. Then a man from Federal Bureau of Investigation approached Galbraith. It seemed as if he had been replaced. Now this tall young man gave the impression not of a stern policeman, but of a quiet student at a cadet school. He addressed him respectfully. Mr. Inspector, while you were in the bathroom, the telephone rang upstairs. I picked up the phone and was ordered to report to you to come to the police department immediately. Curious. Did the caller not introduce himself? Hearing this, Galbraith again prepared for the worst. No, but from the voice I determined that the subscriber was aged, the agent answered obediently. It's Skymore, there was no doubt, Galbraith thought with some dissatisfaction. Is Mr. Chief Inspector really so bored that he first calls me to his home, and then the next day to office? Approved, Galbraith came close to the agent. Now you listen to me. If I have now been ordered to leave, then I do not dare disobey the orders of my superiors, but I want you let this eat into your mind. If it's in your stupid head the idea to be rude to this girl will come again, I swear I will scrape you out from earth. You got that? Roger, Mr. Inspector, the agent answered with such intonation as if he had been told good news. Well, way to go. Man from Federal Bureau of Investigation came out into the yard. Galbraith, gathering his thoughts, went to the bedside table, which stood next to the mirror. His gaze fell on the photograph lying there among some clay cats and artificial berries. This photo captured all three of this family, Mr. Yonce in a strict black suit, and on his left hand Mrs. Yonce in a wedding dress. The woman was holding a baby wrapped in swaddling clothes in her arms. Delia, the inspector immediately realized. In the lower right corner was the date, May 20th, 1981. It's curious, he thought, it turns out that the spouses decided to sign after the birth of their daughter. Galbraith, without giving the report in the actions, grabbed this photograph and put it in his jacket pocket. And he turned around when he heard footsteps. Thank God it was Matt. The doctor, sweating profusely, turned to the inspector. This guy told me that you are going to the police now, he said in a somewhat tired tone. Well, good luck to you. It seemed, the inspector thought, that the doctor meant the man from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Thanks for saying that, Matt, he said soulfully. Galbraith shook the doctor's hand and went outside. Delia stood near the gate, apparently waiting to be put into the car. The inspector, passing by her, caught her holy glare. His head over heels, Galbraith had a strange feeling that he was seeing this girl for the last time. Then farewell to Delia, he said briefly, walking next to her and going out the gate. What, you are leaving me? The girl took 2 hesitant steps towards him. Stay here, but I need to go to the city. We'll take care of you, without looking back, Inspector said loudly. Take care. Lord. If only, Galbraith did not have time to think through this thought, because, rushing forward, he almost knocked some old woman to the ground. Sorry, do you know how to get to the center from here? In an apologetic tone, Galbraith turned to the nearly unconscious woman. Did you are not a local? She asked displeasedly. You might have killed me. Without further ado, Galbraith showed her his police identifier. This paper, like a magic wand, immediately made the old woman bow to the inspector. You can get to the center from here by bus, the elderling helpfully explained. You're just in time for. Where is the stop? Galbraith interrupted her. The old woman straightened her apron and began to talk, blinking her eyes. Will you walk along this road? At the same time she pointed her hand to the left, then turn right, go past the tobacco shop, and then go straight. When you hit the concrete barrier, turn left and there will be a bus stop. Thanks, the inspector nodded and started running. You'll reach the city in about 40 minutes, the elderling shouted after him, but Galbraith no longer heard anything. When he got to the right place, he saw the bus standing still and the driver had already turned on the engine. Without stopping running, Galbraith began to frantically wave his arms, giving a sign. Soon he was standing in the middle of the cabin, tightly gripping the handrail with his right hand. Everything he experienced that day was mixed up in his head: analysis of the cryptic passages incident, breakfast with coffee and sausages, song about nuclear war, drinking sweet coffee from Matt's vacuum flask, conversation with Elspeth Roselew, the Yonce's neighbor, training of man from Federal Bureau of Investigation and, of course, the eyes, the dark eyes of a 10-year-old girl, which were forever imprinted in his memory. Bang! The gun goes off. On a paper shooting target with a picture of a human silhouette appeared a small bullet hole, and a small cloud of smoke rose into the air. Outside the bullseye again, Galbraith said with annoyance, lowering his target pistol. Imagine that you are aiming not at an abstract figure, but at your enemy, his partner advised him. Having said that, Mr. Chief Inspector Scamore took aim and pulled the trigger. The next shot rang out. The bullet hit the 9th circle. Yeah, I have trouble keeping up with you, the inspector said wearily. Galbraith, putting his target pistol on the table, glanced at the shooting target, almost completely riddled with bullet holes. Mr. Chief Inspector followed his example. Then he picked up a rag and, wiping his hands on it, said, Listen, Galbraith. I understood your health condition and decided to suit your sensibilities. And if more specifically, his interlocutor did not understand. With this in mind, you must rest and relax. There will be no tasks until the day after tomorrow. I am flattered, but the inspector was confused. However, it is necessary. We are not machines, Galbraith. Policemen, like all people, also need recreation. I give you permission to spend one day as you please. Well, I won't dare to disobey your order. He made a somewhat theatrical bow and walked towards the exit from the police shooting range. Already closing the door behind him, he turned around. Mr. Chief Inspector Scamore stood in the same place, continuing to wipe his hands on an old towel. There was something so majestic in his whole posture that Galbraith was suddenly seized with an almost sacred thrill, and he, putting his hands in the pockets of his jacket, resolutely walked away from the station. After walking a few blocks, the inspector found himself on the avenue and, glancing at the bright neon signs, turned up his collar and headed towards the subway station. Now he didn't care whether he met that strange Mr. Yonce's doppelganger there or not. As a matter of fact, this is exactly what happened. As he thought, the subway trip went without any incidents. Having got off at the desired station, Galbraith noticed that he had run out of smoking. Without delaying this matter, he purchased them at the kiosk, which was located right there on the platform. He lit a cigarette and, taking a drag as he walked, headed towards About Street. His soul felt light and calm as never before. Galbraith even felt like either a messiah or a savior, who was sent to a well-deserved rest. Everything that had happened all day, in his opinion, was an excellent reason to go to the bar. It's not that there was anything worthy of special attention, it's just that the inspector at the moment wanted to immerse himself in the atmosphere of general fun. It was with this in mind that he went down the steps. This evening, the basement where the establishment was located was very crowded, despite the fact that by this time there were almost no people on the streets. Galbraith, who still clearly remembered that moment with the heated beer, decided not to experiment with the order and to the bartender's routine question Brown Horse, nodded his head affirmatively. Pouring the amber fusel-smelling liquid into his throat, he watched without much interest as the skinny guys jerked all their limbs to the synthesizer music coming from the speaker hanging from the ceiling. After some time, which Galbraith spent filling himself with cheap booze, he felt completely relaxed and, having already begun to nod off, moved towards the exit of the bar. On the street, for a couple of moments he remembered Delia and his own farewell words to her, "We'll take care of you." He'll probably should have called the police department and asked about the baby's fate, but, firstly, it was already too late, and secondly, the inspector really wanted to go to bed. When Galbraith had almost reached the entrance of his house, a heavy downpour began, and he, squinting from the headlights of cars occasionally passing along the street, involuntarily stopped in place, exposing his face to the streams of cold water. Actually, it would be good to die, right here and now, thought Galbraith, looking detachedly at the heavy raindrops falling from the sky. For me it's better than living to old age, without understanding anything in this life. But common sense mixed with cowardice persistently told him that no, it's worth die only as a last resort, he can't give up out of nowhere, even if his soul really wants it, because life is a gift of fate that needs to be used as carefully as possible. When Galbraith entered his apartment, all his clothes were thoroughly soaked with water. Pulling off his tight patent leather shoes from his feet, he stood in his socks in front of the mirror and peered intently at his reflection. It was difficult for him to recognize himself in this creature, soaked to the skin, whose face, under the influence of alcohol, expressed only dull, almost animal indifference. "Is that really me?" escaped from Galbraith's lips. "How did I end up like this?" Continuing to look in the mirror, the inspector thought about how, if something happened, he could explain his condition to others. Well, don't count an explanation the fact that, on the eve of one whole day of vacation, he decided, probably for the first time in his life, to get drunk until he lost his human appearance? Few will take this excuse seriously. Although, the inspector thought, this is not so scary, the main thing is not to forget that the day after tomorrow him will need to return into the workflow. In the depths of his soul, a premonition of something bad suddenly stirred and ached. He expected to meet the next morning with a hot head, a stuffy nose and a loss of strength, but what was the inspector's surprise when he woke up in his bed completely healthy? There was certainly nothing to indicate that he had spent the evening in the pouring rain yesterday. Galbraith even specially measured his temperature, 95 degrees Fahrenheit. The thermometer, unlike self-awareness, could not be fooled. Well, he thought, that means he will spend one day of his vacation in a great shape. As he sat down to breakfast, he thought that the reason he didn't get sick was because he had drunk at least 10 glasses of brown horse in the bar before. It's not surprising that with so much alcohol in his body, the cold simply fought back. Galbraith remembered that he simply threw off his wet clothes in the bathroom, without even bothering to wring them out. Thank goodness, there was exactly the same formal suit hanging in his wardrobe. At one time, the inspector specially bought 2 identical sets, realizing that he, a police inspector, should always appear in public in a manner that inspires respect. Having put on a new suit, from which there was a slight aroma of cologne, Galbraith looked in the mirror in the hallway. Yes, now the thought will definitely not occur to anyone that last night this stern, mustachioed man had the chance to descend to the level of the most disgusting scum of society. He left the house without any plan for further action. Yesterday's drinking session was quite a relaxation, if that's how one could describe it. Galbraith had always loathed of gambling or looking for girls of easy virtue, one might say. He was horrified by the mere thought that such a thing was even possible. So he decided to just take a walk around the city. Shaking off the dust from sleeves, the inspector walked up the street, looking around aimlessly and swaying slightly to the rhythm of a song in his head that he had heard back when he was a student at the Portland Police Academy. The weather was beautiful, as if there had been no rain last night. Only the almost dry puddles served as a reminder of this natural phenomenon. The view was complemented by children running along the sidewalks, ladies strolling, men walking importantly. Galbraith decided, as always, to keep himself busy looking at the signs. For some reason this gave him special pleasure. Maybe it was due to the fact that in the place near Gloucester, where he spent his childhood, he never saw shop windows or advertisements. For the shops he visited there were modest tents standing in the open air. At least that's how it was in the 60s of the 20th century. What was happening in his homeland now, the inspector could not know due to many factors. Galbraith was attracted by the sign of a small pastry shop nestled next to the Faux Museum. There was a small sign on the glass that said closed and some kind of telephone number circled in red pencil. But this was not what attracted the attention of the police inspector, but something completely different. There was a pink sign above the door, on which to the right of a beautifully depicted cupcake and a tall glass was written in large block letters beverages and desserts. Galbraith rubbed his eyes. No, he was not mistaken, in the word dessert the third letter for some reason went to the very end. Apparently, the owner of this pastry shop was an immigrant from behind the Iron Curtain, where is this word actually spelled with one S, but Galbraith did not have time to finish his thought, because he, not noticing the curb, tripped over it. Another second, and he, having lost his balance, would have flown down onto the sidewalk wet from yesterday's rain. But he was lucky, someone's strong hands managed to catch him. He saw above him an elderly tanned face with a black mustache. So, did you bent at such an early hour? The man asked him with a strange accent. The mustachioed savior put him on his feet and busily looked at the inspector. No, I just was staring at that sign, Galbraith said embarrassedly. I know you Americans, it is the morning, the drinking, the man answered calmly, stretching. The inspector wanted to answer that he was from England, but decided not to be offended by trifles. Well, where are you from? He asked this man a question. He wasn't sure if he really wanted to know, but don't really run away from here. Ich bin Deutscher, the man proudly blurted out in response. So that's what kind of accent he had, Galbraith realized. He raised his head. It turned out that his savior was standing at a thick wooden door, above which hung a sign Onkel Korbel Licht Spielsalon. The last word vaguely reminded him of his native English movie theater. Are they showing a movie here? Galbraith nodded at the inscription. His interlocutor seemed to be just waiting for this passerby to ask him about it. The German's huge lips stretched into a smile. How else? For German immigrants, Onkel Korbel founded a small cinema here 2 years ago. The inspector thought doubtfully about what kind of cinema there could be in a room that had clearly previously housed a small store, but he decided not to show his mind. "And what films are shown here?" he asked. "In Deutsch, of course. However, if you don't know our language at all, this is not a problem." "Can I come to the session?" Galbraith began to be overcome by curiosity. "You're just in time, last seat left." "All right, then I'm all in." Galbraith gave this German some money, as much as the ticket cost, and, opening the heavy door, entered a small but spacious hall. The decoration of this room alternated between wood and brick, and it seemed to the inspector who entered that the only thing missing to complete the ambience was stretched skins and other hunting trophies that could be hung all over the walls. However, signs of modern American life were also present in this dimly lit establishment. In the farthest corner there was a white canvas on a thick iron tripod, obviously it served as a screen. There were 4 rows of chairs in front of him. There were 20 seats in total, of which only one was free. Ironically, it was located closest to the exit. The contingent that gathered in this low-ceilinged room seemed to consist exclusively of lean, middle-aged men with short black hair. More than half of them had a thin black mustache, like the usher standing at the exit. Galbraith involuntarily caught himself thinking that he was invited to this place not least because he himself had a short haircut and a mustache. It might well be possible that the usher had a liking for people of other nations who were in some way similar to his compatriots. While waiting for the film to be shown, the audience quietly talked to each other. The inspector, sitting down on a chair with a high carved back and a soft seat, listened to their conversation. Of course, he did not hear a single word of English. All those gathered, as the usher warned him, were Germans who, for some purpose, immigrated from their historical homeland to America, das gelobte Land. Soon a click was heard above the heads of those gathered. Apparently, a projector hidden somewhere under the ceiling began its work. Galbraith, having made himself comfortable on this chair, not the most suitable for watching a movie, fixed his eyes on the screen and from the very first frame found himself captivated by the mesmerizing spectacle. It was possible to say with confidence that Onkel Korbel, who, according to the ticket taker, founded this small cinema, did not skimp on ensuring that at the end of the session the audience, no matter how much they wanted, would not be able to forget this moving picture show. From the very first frames the film promised something very mysterious and unusual. In the middle of the red desert terrain, which strongly reminded Galbraith of the views of Glen Canyon, a horseman rode. There was one detail in his appearance that immediately caught the inspector's eye. This young man had gray hair that reached his shoulders. The operator's camera slowly changed angles as the man continued to make his way through the red sands. The image was not particularly saturated, the screen flickered often, because of which Galbraith immediately realized that Onkel Korbel, who opened this establishment, simply played smuggled German video home systems tapes here. Being a policeman, he could easily charge the owner of the establishment with illegally showing films, but firstly, today was his day off, and secondly, he was so captivated by what was happening on the screen that he forgot to think about his responsibilities. Meanwhile, the film continued. A short man, dressed in tattered rags, joined the gray-haired horseman. Galbraith could not understand a single word of the dialogue that the characters were conducting among themselves, but there was no particular need for this. Soon these two entered some village, and guards appeared in the frame, dressed in some kind of ridiculous armor, as if made of cardboard. The long-haired man rebuffed them, and then suddenly there was such a sudden change of frame, accompanied by a loud stinger of synthesizer keys, that the inspector involuntarily shuddered in his chair. The red deserts were replaced by a view of black space, in which an iron octahedron with precise rows of dots symbolizing portholes on all surfaces slowly rotated between the white points of faces. Curious plagiarism from Mr. Lucas flashed through Galbraith's head. Then the desert views returned again, accompanied by a woman's voiceover. The same long-haired man drove through incredibly squalid streets, where ugly clay statues stood. Then the action moved indoors, and now the cameraman generously filmed the interiors, which, according to the director's idea, were apparently supposed to symbolize a medieval castle, but looked more like some kind of garbage dump. Ugly, disgusting people of both sexes moved among the yellowish stones, wooden posts and torn rags. Almost all the men had long gray hair, despite the fact that there were practically no old men among the extras. Apparently, Galbraith thought, the actors were simply wearing wigs. Perhaps the only characters among this rabble who were more or less like normal people were the monks. They were all perfectly bald, wearing black robes, which in one short scene showed them running around a stone hall. According to the plot, apparently, they were looking for some manuscripts. Galbraith didn't really understand what was happening on the screen. It wasn't just that he didn't know German, it was difficult to simply understand what was going on in this film incarnation of Sodom and Gomorrah. Some half-naked women, loud, frail men. The inspector involuntarily realized that the only normal one among all the characters was that young long-haired knight who was introduced at the very beginning. Although, sometimes the action was transferred to a completely different place, as if the interior of a spaceship. There, next to the huge screen, which, as Galbraith understood, showed the view from the eyes of the protagonist, people dressed in long white robes with short hair walked. The actors playing them behaved somehow arrogantly, as if the director specifically wanted to create the impression that everyone in space was so perfect, but on Earth, on the contrary, they were dirty freaks. The inspector thought so because he thought that the main action takes place in the Middle Ages. This would at least be logical. Among all the actors who were involved in this film, the only person who was known to Galbraith was the one and only Werner Herzog. His character, dressed in dirty rags, was brought out of prison by that long-haired knight, but his screen time came to an end rather quickly, when Werner Herzog started shouting something at the camera with expression. A guard with a spear ran up to him from behind and the eminent actor fell to his knees as if knocked down. Galbraith even felt a little offended. After all, he was the only famous actor, but he was given such a tiny role. Then the director showed the audience the protagonist's home life, in addition to a strange room with white walls, which apparently was some kind of laboratory. In the house of a long-haired knight there lived a boorish boy and a red-haired woman with a pretty face dressed in a dirty dress. For some reason, Galbraith immediately realized that she was the love interest of the main character. Then came even stranger shots. A long-haired knight came into some cave, where, pulling off his wig, without which the actor who played him looked somehow pathetic, waited until a helicopter painted in strange colors landed nearby. Lord, the inspector thought, what was going on in the director's head when he made decisions about what to insert into his film? Then the environment of faceless characters was slightly diluted by a mustachioed black-haired man with a rough voice and a long sword. Galbraith involuntarily admired how this warrior started a fight in some tavern, and then began to drink together with the protagonist. True, then a rather vulgar scene followed, where that lady with a pretty face was roughly stripped on camera. The inspector involuntarily looked away when the cameraman began generously showing the audience her naked body. The fact is that Galbraith always believed that cinema is art, food for the mind, which should not indulge the base instincts of the audience. Then the screen showed how the protagonist gets into a helicopter and soars up. The scene of his flight over the red sands was remembered by the inspector as the embodiment of the brutality of the absurd. It was even funnier when the hero had to throw himself out of this flying colossus, which did not fail to explode graphically right in the air. Galbraith thought that this was probably a response to Hollywood. They say, while you blow up unfortunate cars on camera in your films, in our Germany we blow up entire helicopters. True, it was clear that the fire of the explosion was simply superimposed on the frame, but this was a problem for the special effects masters. Then there was a rather boring scene where the long-haired man and his girlfriend began to copulate. Thank God the director came up with an original move. This moment was demonstrated on the screen of a spaceship with a filter somewhat similar to the vision of the main villain from the hottest blockbuster of 1987. Yes, Galbraith thought, the creators of this film turned on their imagination when borrowing techniques from foreign cinema. For some reason, the inspector was even pleased when the protagonist's beloved was captured by the guards. Maybe because the medieval instruments of torture shown during this scene shocked his imagination, or maybe simply because he wanted the film to no longer have erotic moments with this lady. The ending of the film was consistent with what happened on the screen before it. First, the villain, a small, dry old man, with one swing of his sword, cut off the head of a mustachioed warrior already known to the audience. Then, when he climbed the tower, the same tramp from the beginning of the film began to shoot at him from a blaster. After the old man fell down in a puff of white smoke, the tramp began to shoot everyone who stood around him. The actor was apparently told to feel like a mad monkey who was given a firearm in his hands. Then suddenly an octagonal spaceship began to descend from the sky, and the entire crowd began to theatrically fall to the ground. Apparently, according to the plot, this should have meant that they were drugged with sleeping gas. People in white robes took the long-haired knight onto the ship, and the woman who led them gave her bracelet to the protagonist's beloved. It was strange for Galbraith to look at all this bacchanalia, sitting on an uncomfortable wooden chair in a dark room, where besides him there were 19 more foreigners smelling of sweat and cigarettes. But when the final credits began to roll on the screen, he involuntarily remained sitting in place while everyone else, briefly exchanging impressions, began to leave the hall. Apparently, it was in the song, very beautiful, slightly naive young vocals sounded under beautiful piano chords, and the inspector was surprised by the fact that the text was not in German, but in English. The song was about a certain man who had to live in a strange empire and play the role of Lord God. As the refrain sang, the latter was not an easy, but since the fire still burns, why not give yourself a chance? Galbraith understood that he shouldn't delve too deeply into the meaning of the song, the main task of which was to be the musical background for the final credits, but the fact that it contained English words could not help but touch him in this place saturated with the German spirit. As the credits came to an end, Galbraith only now noticed that he was the only one still in the premises of the bootleg cinema. Stretching out to his full height, he stood up from the chair and, straightening his stiff muscles, left the dim room. The mustachioed German usher was still standing at the entrance. The inspector wanted to exchange a few words with him regarding what he had just seen. "Have you seen this film yourself?" he asked, handing the German a cigarette. "How could I not watch what I was going to show to the audience?" the usher responded with some resentment, accepting the gift. "Well, what do you think of it?" "I have no idea if you know, but this director, to put it mildly, specializes in films for adults, so the creation itself is appropriate," the usher replied, taking a drag. Galbraith remembered shots of half-naked women in the slums, 2 scenes with the main character's naked lover. Yes, it was difficult to disagree with this definition. And if you dig little deeper, the inspector did not let up. "So, it's actually based on a Russian book," as if revealing some shameful secret, the mustachioed usher answered embarrassedly. "Have you read it?" "Never had a chance. But experts say that the director did not understand its essence and ended up filming rare nonsense." Nonsense. Well, the inspector thought, yes, it's hard not to resist using this word to describe the wild, absurd mixture of the Middle Ages, space and helicopters, generously sprinkled with ugly makeup on the actors and cheap scenery. "If you're asking me about this film like that, does that mean it made an impression on you?" the usher-taker himself decided to ask the question. "I like it," Galbraith answered briefly. The inspector could not even expect what he would receive in response to this modest phrase. Haha. "If you, an American, liked the delusional creation of not the best German director, then I'm even afraid to imagine the depths to which your own filmmakers have sunk." Galbraith involuntarily leaned against the wall. And the usher, stretching forward his hand in which he held a smoking cigarette, continued his speech as a critic. "The machine of your cinema consists more than entirely of parts stolen in Europe. You steal the worst ideas of our directors and make this, as you call it, a business out of it. Your cinema is not dead, it has been dead since birth," the German spoke accusatorily. Maybe, Galbraith thought, could finally tell this proud German that, as an Englishman, it was funny for him to listen to an insult to a culture foreign to me? Although deep down he understood that the usher did not care what nationality his listener was, he simply wanted to vent his frustration at the fact that, due to lack of work in his homeland, he had to smuggle in a country for which he had imbibed hatred almost with his mother's milk. Okay, I understand, he said. By the way, aren't you Corbel himself? The usher stopped his anti-American ranting and looked at his interlocutor in surprise. You are probably the first person to confuse me with Uncle Corbel. Every German here knows him. Well, I'm not German, Galbraith winked at him slyly. I'm his right hand, if it hasn't dawned on you yet, the usher hit himself in the chest. Good luck staying here, he waved his hand. The inspector walked down the street in a good mood. Around him passers-by were scurrying back and forth along the sidewalk, excited about something. At that moment, the world seemed amazingly beautiful and attractive to him. A noticeable heat was already hanging over the city, the air was trembling, and it seemed that a barely noticeable glow was emanating from the city buildings. Just an optical illusion, thought Galbraith. For the joy he went into one of the shops spread throughout the city and bought a piece of smoked meat and a bottle of white wine. It's not like there's no food left in his refrigerator, the inspector just wanted to, before falling into bed, sit by the window for a while and wash down finely chopped boiled pork with alcohol, look at the street, at the fallen leaves lying on the wet pavement, and remembering everyone with whom he had at least some pleasant moments of his life. However, as soon as Galbraith stepped through the threshold of his apartment, he suddenly felt that the fun seemed to have disappeared from his head. Instead of setting a small table by the window and sitting in a chair, the inspector pulled off his loafers, hung his jacket on the always open kitchen door and, putting the boiled pork with a bottle in the refrigerator, put a frying pan on the stove. Opening the window in the kitchen, he noisily sucked in the cold air. Galbraith felt a little better. A few minutes later he, getting ready to go to work again tomorrow, started preparing dinner. Lately Galbraith has been lazy about cooking anything more complicated than pasta, but today he decided to make a small exception. He will treat himself to an omelette with tomatoes. For this purpose, he pulled out the two above-mentioned vegetables from the refrigerator, crumbled them and threw them into a hot frying pan. Then the inspector took out a deep plastic plate and broke 3 eggs into it. Then added a little milk, a pinch of salt, and thoroughly beat this mixture with a fork. Alas, he had neither a mixer nor a whisk at home. Having poured the milk-egg mixture into the frying pan, Galbraith covered it with a lid and, after adjusting the flame of the burner, went to his bedroom. There he sat down on the bed and stared out the window, behind which dusk was already gathering. 10 minutes passed. He reluctantly got up and went to the kitchen, where dinner was already waiting for him. Placing the omelette on a plate, he pulled a chair closer to the table and began to eat. Moments from the film he watched in the illegal cinema for German immigrants were still flashing through his mind. The inspector tried to remember what the essence of this work was, but only shots of the protagonist's naked girlfriend came to mind. Then Galbraith began to turn over in his mind all the phrases that other spectators uttered during the session, but since his knowledge of the German language did not allow him to understand it by ear, he quickly stopped this pointless activity. After finishing the dinner, he washed the plate and returned to the bedroom. Night had already fallen outside the window. He lay down on the bed and fell asleep. After the experience, the inspector's sleep was surprisingly calm and even. The next morning, Galbraith was awakened by a phone call. With some reluctance, he walked barefoot directly to the telephone and picked up the receiver. Maestro, c'est você. Você means you. The unknown caller seemed to be bursting with joy. It was difficult for him to understand what gender the caller was, he raised his voice so high. The inspector was slightly taken aback. Apparently, the subscriber was counting on being told hello in response. Or something like that. However, Galbraith only frowned and hung up. Despite the stranger's joking tone, one could even say hysterical, the thought occurred to Galbraith that this seemingly absurd message carried some kind of menacing meaning. The inspector sat down on the bed and began to pull up his trousers. Trying to understand the meaning of the Portuguese lesson he had just heard, he felt a vague anxiety associated with this call. If that person really was a complete stranger, which Galbraith really doubted, because it was unlikely that anyone could accidentally dial his home number, then for what purpose did the subscriber call him? Check if the owner is home? Galbraith was already beginning to regret picking up the phone. He was sure that whoever was calling, he himself was in for serious trouble. Somehow pulling on his pants and buttoning his shirt, he trudged into the bathroom, where he washed his face and brushed his teeth for a long time in order to finally shake off the remnants of sleep. Having washed himself and finally woke up, he left the bathroom and glanced at the clock hanging in the corridor. It was 20 minutes to 11. I overslept again, Galbraith thought. I should have set the alarm last night. However, it won't get any worse, he reassured himself. Just think, what the big deal, to sleep for 2 hours. He suddenly remembered that he had not washed his wet-in-the-rain suit since the day before yesterday. Rushing back to the bathroom, Galbraith began sorting through the already slightly damp pile of wet rags that he had thrown behind the bathtub. Suddenly a white edge stuck out from his jacket pocket. The inspector grabbed it and pulled it towards him. In his hand was the same photograph that, by some strange inspiration, he took from the bedside table in the Yonce's house. Looking at the chubby face of the baby sleeping in arms of Mrs. Yonce, Galbraith seemed to be struck by lightning. Oh God, Delia. From the moment he said goodbye to the girl after the call from Mr. Chief Inspector Scaymore, Galbraith did not particularly think about her, but now, looking at the photo, he realized that he could not hesitate. So he decided to have a quick breakfast and go to the police department. Putting a photo of a happy family on the nightstand in the hallway, he quickly walked into the kitchen and immediately opened the refrigerator. So, boiled pork and a bottle of white wine. These were the only foods that did not require cooking. Taking them out of the refrigerator, Galbraith began to cut the smoked meat into thick slices, thinking that, of course, drinking alcohol before work was not the best idea, but he simply did not want to waste precious time on such essentially useless things as cooking of coffee. When only crumbs remained on the plate, he looked at the glassy greenish bottle. Yes, he didn't even notice how he drank all the wine to the bottom. Throwing it into the trash can under the sink, Galbraith looked at the clean jacket, which he had hung right on the kitchen door the previous evening. Having put it on, the inspector took a photograph of the Yonce family from the bedside table and, saying to the sleeping baby, "Sorry I'm so late," put it in his jacket pocket as he walked. The usual route is the stairwell, then down the steps to the entrance. Going out into the street, the inspector gave his gaze to the sun shining in the sky and quickly walked towards the subway. Having gone underground, he had to wait 3 minutes for his train. As soon as the carriage finally approached the station, he dived through the open doors and, seeing that all the seats were occupied, grabbed the handrail. Having got off at the desired station, Galbraith went upstairs with all the other people and almost ran to his police department. When he almost reached his goal, he suddenly saw a rosy-cheeked doctor sitting on a bench under a pillar on which hung an agitational banner, "Magistratus opertet servire populo," the police must serve the people. "Good day, Matt," Galbraith shouted as he approached. "Hi," he will answer in a colorless voice. The doctor, resting both hands on the bench, turned his head to the inspector, who had already approached him. By his appearance, could immediately tell that he was not in the mood, as if something was bothering him. This was not a good sign for Galbraith. "Do you know how young Lady Yonce is doing?" With these words, the inspector, whose veins seemed to be on fire under the influence of a drunk bottle of wine, sat down next to Matt. "This is the essence of things," the doctor said gloomily, looking somewhere ahead. "I'm sorry," Galbraith, who had already begun to suspect something, moved a little closer to neighbor. "Today's news stinks," the doctor turned to his interlocutor. "Buddy, you're not in a hurry, are you?" His eyes sparkled strangely. "No. But why do they stinks?" The inspector was slightly surprised. "Listen here. Anyway, when we brought the girl here," he nodded towards the police department building. "She began to complain about, well, as is usual with womankind." Matt was a little embarrassed. "What, you mean it's Delia started menstruating?" "In 10 years, the inspector's face fell. "Yeah, it's rare, but it's not impossible," the doctor said hastily. "But I'm not going to talk about that." In short, Manic Maurice came up to her complaint and she began to describe to him. Briefly, then girl said that she had a parasite inside her. That doesn't make any sense, the inspector dropped his head to his knees. Of course she didn't put it that way, Matt said defensively. There are no such thing. In general, Maurice became worried and told the girl to be taken to Randall Children's Hospital and volunteered to accompany her himself. At these words, Matt took a breath and raised his hand to his sweaty forehead. So keep doing it, Galbraith succeeded him. Then I can only remember what he himself told me, since I was not an eyewitness to those events, his interlocutor answered somewhat carefree. Matt, having said these words in the tone of a comedian who is waiting for applause at the end of his performance, blew his nose directly into his hand and, wiping it on the bench, as a result of which his neighbor involuntarily moved away. The rosy-cheeked doctor then continued. In general, Maurice with Delia arrived at Randall Children's Hospital, and there they immediately went to see a gynecologist. He, having examined the patient, said that she really had something inside. Galbraith froze with his mouth open. No, it wasn't pregnancy, this is something else, Matt said confidently. Galbraith, who was a little reassured by the doctor's remark, asked what happened next. And then the gynecologist told Maurice that they would put the young lady in the ward for now and begin preparations for the operation to remove. Oh, forgot this medical term. But I remember that, according to Maurice, that man had never encountered anything like this before in his entire career. A rather interesting story, Galbraith nodded. I have not yet finished, Matt called his interlocutor's attention. Then Maurice, leaving his home phone number to the gynecologist, left the hospital and went home. This was the day before yesterday. Okay, so what happened next? And yesterday they called him late in the evening. They said that they had already looked at everything and prepared for everything, and tomorrow they would perform a hysterectomy on the little girl. What exactly do they do? The inspector didn't understand. Galbraith thought that he had come across such a word before, but forgot its meaning. Uterus removal, Matt said as he ran off. My God, having shouted this, the inspector grabbed his head. I am also shocked by it too, like you, the doctor began to calm him down. Even at 28 years old, such an operation is already a serious step, but here is a little child. Why they decided to do it, Galbraith, with a fire in his eyes, jumped up from the bench. All right, bud, cool, Matt tried to pacify the interlocutor, but he did not let up. Tell me why, he exclaimed almost theatrically. Well, Maurice told me that this thing, I don't remember the term, almost completely grown into the endometrium, and without complete removal of the uterus, the gynecologist saw no other way to help the young lady. The explosion of despair gave way to despondency. Galbraith sank back onto the bench next to Matt. And this morning Maurice received a call that the girl, how should I put it, the doctor began to look for words. Don't hesitate, please, muttered the inspector. In general, staff of Randall Children's Hospital said that her pulse had stopped being palpable. There was silence, broken only by Matt's noisy breathing. Galbraith felt his own heart ready to jump out of his chest. What was the name of the gynecologist who led the operation? He asked after a minute. A plan for further action began to emerge in his mind. I recall Maurice saying it was, the doctor began to remember. Name, bud, I need a name, Galbraith yelled at the pink-cheeked man. How you much hotter, Matt pulled away from him. So, he told me that the gynecologist introduced himself to him as Dr. Baselard. Galbraith immediately jumped up from the bench and rushed to the police department. Matt shouted something after him, but the wind in his ears prevented the inspector from hearing his words. Once inside the building itself, he slowed down and, without greeting anyone, went up to the second floor to his office. There he sat down at the table and, moving the telephone closer to him, dialed the helpline number. When the receiver said hello, I'm listening to you, Galbraith, trying to give his voice as calm an intonation as possible, asked to be told the telephone number of the management of Randall Children's Hospital. The response he received was wait a couple of minutes. The inspector put the phone down next to the machine and began looking for paper. When he finally put a blank sheet in front of him and took a pen from his desk drawer, right came from the receiver. Holding it with his shoulder, Galbraith grabbed a pen and wrote down the hospital's telephone number on paper under dictation. Thanking him, he ended the call and, running his eyes over the sheet, dialed the number. They answered the phone almost immediately. "You called Randall Children's Hospital," Galbraith heard a melodic female voice. "Hello, could you give me Dr. Baselard's home address?" "We do not disclose personal," the call girl started, but the inspector interrupted her. "I'm from Portland Police Bureau," he said dryly. "Okay, hold the line," answered a female voice. Galbraith had to wait a few minutes. Finally, the call girl returned and began to dictate the address to him. The inspector barely had time to grab the pen. When he wrote the last letter, a female voice asked him anything else, but he just said goodbye and ended the call. Well, wonderful, he thought, here it is, the address of the man who killed an innocent child with his own hands. Galbraith, having reread the paper several times, folded it 4 times and put it in the same pocket where the photograph of 3 happy people lay. Galbraith left the police department building. He glanced at the bench by the post. Matt had already left somewhere. This doesn't matter at all, he thought. A yellow car with a characteristic checkerboard pattern on the door was driving towards him. The inspector stopped the taxi and, having told the driver the street name and house number, sat back in the back seat. He began to figure that Dr. Baselard was probably still in the hospital now, so there was a high probability that he might not find him at home. Galbraith wasn't sure what he really wanted to get out of this visit, but he was firmly convinced that he needed to cross paths with this man before the case of the death of Delia Yonce under the X-Acto knife got to court of justice, so there was no time to waste. The driver quickly delivered the passenger to the desired address, and in gratitude for the service, Galbraith gave the taxi driver a generous tip, and the car moved on. Meanwhile, the inspector himself stopped next to a 5-story building and, with his hands on his hips, began to look up. The call girl told him the number of Dr. Baselard's apartment, but he was puzzled about how to get there. Galbraith did not have the necessary keys, master keys, or anything like that with him. Will he really have to climb through the window, like in cheap spy movies? These thoughts were interrupted by a man of about 50 who, walking next to the inspector, accidentally touched him with his shoulder. Galbraith, deciding that it was worth trying his luck, immediately turned to this man. "It's you, Dr. Baselard," he said a little naively. The old man stopped and turned to the inspector who had called out to him. He had a wrinkled face and a round head with almost no hair left on it. His eyes, swollen with fat, looked at Galbraith with some kind of affectionate reproach. Seeing these eyes, he was suddenly transported in his mind a whole 24 years ago. This is the same Mr. Baselard who often visited his father's house and, right in front of little Galbraith's eyes, sat by the fireplace in the living room and shared his stories with the owners. During his stories, Galbraith's father always smiled absent-mindedly at this then 26-year-old gentleman, and his mother, who occasionally came to them from the kitchen to find out if he needed to bring him anything, shook her head and muttered something unintelligible. The inspector always remembered how Mr. Baselard shared with them his case involving an operation on the brain of a woodcutter. He still remembered the poor guy's name, Duncan. The bottom line was that an elderly woodcutter was diagnosed with a brain tumor, and his wife decided to contact the doctors at the local hospital. Mr. Baselard, who was then the chief surgeon there, immediately took Duncan under his wing and, keeping him in isolation, watched him for a long time, as if expecting something. And one fine day, when the woodcutter finally lost the ability to think, not least because of the conditions in which he was kept, Mr. Baselard dragged him into the operating room, where, after injecting him with painkillers, he got down to deal. The inspector remembered how Baselard told his family in detail about how he to start performed a trepanation on Duncan, then cut the brain tissue and began to remove the tumor. But when it turned out that it had grown into the frontal lobes, Mr. Baselard realized that this was capitulation. He did not say then what happened to Duncan at the end of the operation, but the woodcutter's funeral, which took place the day after the doctor's story, spoke more than words. All this time, Galbraith was sure that Dr. Baselard had died long ago, and now he looked with surprise at him, alive and well, and moreover, having acquired a prestigious position in one of the best hospitals in Portland. "May I ask what this is regarding?" His thoughts were interrupted by the quiet but firm voice of an old man. Instead of answering, Galbraith showed him his police identifier. The doctor silently nodded his head, and, opening the entrance door, let the policeman forward. Rising to the 5th floor, he turned to the inspector with some strange gaiety. "I hope your interest in my person is not too comprehensive," he said. "Don't worry, the police just have a few questions for you," Galbraith answered in a soothing tone. An ocean of hatred seethed inside his entire being, but as a police inspector, Galbraith learned to control its waves. When they finally entered the apartment, he turned to the doctor. "Let's drink tea, and in a quiet atmosphere you will answer me." He didn't have time to finish. "I'll put the kettle on, but you can ask questions right now," Baselard answered helpfully. The inspector looked at him a little more closely. With all his appearance, his interlocutor expressed impatience and hidden irritation. Baselard was clearly in a hurry somewhere, and it was obvious that the unexpected visit of the policeman was not at all part of his plans, but was only an obstacle on the way to some important goal. "You're at it in a hurry?" Galbraith involuntarily asked. "To England, on affairs," his interlocutor hissed the last letter like a snake. The doctor went to the kitchen. "Galbraith thought that I know what your affairs is like there. You killed a child and decided to immediately run away from the crime scene." "Good," he said cheerfully out loud. "You just got out of surgery, I take it?" asked the inspector, trying not to give free rein to his ardor. "It feels like you're clairvoyant, mister," the doctor's voice came from the kitchen. Galbraith looked in and Baselard, rattling some plates, was taking out a pack of tea from the top shelf of the sideboard. "Really, no need for compliments. Who was operated on?" "That so small, so plain thing," the doctor waved him off, placing the kettle under the running water. "Well, plain thing of course," thought Galbraith, interrupted the life of a baby girl who had not even really known this life yet. "What were you doing before?" The inspector realized that Baselard did not recognize him as that little boy from Gloucester. "Well, I did all kinds of surgeries," the interlocutor answered quite willingly. "In America?" Galbraith inquired. "Both in America and in England, where, in fact, I was born," continued the doctor. "All right," the inspector answered dryly. The kettle was gradually starting to heat up. Glancing at the stove, the doctor headed to the sideboard. "So, you drink tea with sweets or just like that?" he asked the guest. Galbraith wanted to agree with the last phrase, but I thought it would be better to make Baselard stay a little longer. "I love marmalade," he lied. "Do you have a couple of pieces?" "I will try to fulfill your plea." Opening the door, the doctor began rummaging through the sideboard. Trying not to shuffle his feet, the inspector quietly slipped into the corridor and, seeing the open door of the cabinet, looked in. His attention was immediately attracted by a high desk on which stood a vase with yellow asters. Next to her were small pieces of paper filled with black numbers. On the topmost of them were visible marks made in red pencil. And then the inspector seemed to have an epiphany. He walked over to the desk and pulled out the bottom drawer. There, among some maps and typewritten sheets, there was a photograph, which Galbraith immediately grabbed in his hands. The yellowed black and white photo showed an incredibly skinny man with a disproportionately large, clean-shaven head, dressed in a straitjacket. He smiled a toothless smile at the photographer, leaning his left hand on the hospital bed. Turning the photo over, Galbraith read the text written in black ink: "Duncan, brain cancer, 1967. "This is definitely the same person," the inspector said, barely audible. He himself did not understand who he was talking about the doctor himself or his long-interred patient. But this evidence finally confirmed that Galbraith was on the right track. Suddenly a loud stomp was heard from behind. He turned around. Dr. Baselard stood on the threshold. His chest was shaking under his suit, and his face was twisted into a grimace of rage. It seemed as if his eyes were trying to pierce right through the guest. But the inspector did not lose his spirit. On the contrary, the state in which the doctor was now in set him in a decisive mood. Galbraith straightened up, stuck out his chest and raised his chin proudly. "You killed this woodcutter 24 years ago," he began in a solemn tone. "And this morning there was a little girl under your X-Acto knife. She walked towards her destiny, could change the course of history, but unfortunately." The inspector was unable to finish his expatiation. "What do you want from me, you worm?" "A confession," the old man screamed so loudly that Galbraith jumped to the side in surprise. "Here's your confession." And at that very second Baselard ran to the desk. Galbraith prepared to fight back, but the doctor simply pulled out the top drawer of the table and, pulling out a stack of papers, threw them into the air. The sheets scattered throughout the room and slowly landed on the floor. The inspector resisted the urge to grab them and see what was written on them. "I disposed with their souls like Lord God, because I felt like doing it. Do you understand?" the owner of the apartment continued to scream in falsetto. Having shouted these words, Dr. Baselard took a little phial of yellow liquid from his pocket and began to unscrew its glass stopper. "Only don't come near me, you wronged, trembling creature," he said, lowering his voice. After that, he threw back his head, throwing the entire contents of the phial into his throat. Galbraith involuntarily became worried. The doctor's body trembled, a wave of trembling passed through him, but he did not even seem to notice it. "You won't go on? Get out of here," he shouted in disgust. Oddly enough, after these words, Baselard, grabbing the briefcase lying next to the door, left the apartment himself. The inspector, continuing to stand at the desk, heard the loud stomping of the doctor coming from the staircase. After waiting for the entrance door to slam, Galbraith finally decided to get out of here. His further actions were extremely unprofessional. He did not conduct a search and did not even close the door of the already abandoned apartment behind him. Remembering the doctor's phrase to England, on affairs, the inspector had long ago realized that their meeting occurred due to a happy coincidence. If Galbraith had been even a minute late, Baselard would have left for the station long ago. Having gone downstairs, Galbraith looked around. As he believed, the doctor had long since disappeared. The inspector hailed a taxi, and after a while he was dropped off right at the entrance to the police department. Getting out of the car, he noticed a young Sergeant Sausher standing at the bench, who was engaged in an animated conversation with an elderly gentleman in an overcoat, from under which a greenish satin vest peeked out. When he saw Galbraith, the sergeant stopped the discussion and stared at him with some curiosity. "How can I help you, Mr. Inspector?" he asked him politely. "Here's the thing, one citizen is from Portugal," the sergeant nodded at the gentleman in the coat. "Accompanied by 3 of his friends, he arrived here and wants to urgently talk with our superiors." The citizen from Portugal himself at that time stood silently next to Sausher and drilled Galbraith with the piercing gaze of his small eyes. His sparse gray hair was carefully combed back, and his mouth was twisted contemptuously, as if he hated being in the company of American policemen. The inspector, without saying a word, walked past them and stepped into the open doors of the department. "But they don't have time to wait, they're in a hurry to get to the airport," Sausher's voice reached his ears. The inspector, having passed through the threshold, was surprised to find that at that time there were unusually many people in the premises of the police department, some adults in civilian clothes, teenagers in tracksuits and old women in colorful dresses. Galbraith, without stopping, went to the office of Mr. Chief Inspector Scaymore. When he went up to the second floor and opened the door to his office, he looked up from his papers and, casting an indifferent glance at the guest, said, "Well, Galbraith, let's see what you dug up there. Will you please take a seat?" He nodded towards the chair, but Galbraith, dryly thanking him, instead pulled out 2 photographs from his pocket and, placing them on the table in front of Mr. Chief Inspector Scaymore, waited until he turned his attention to them. Having carefully examined the photographs, Scaymore raised his full of barely restrained curiosity eyes to incomer. "The first picture shows a woodcutter who died 24 years ago," Galbraith started. "It happened in Gloucester, where I spent my childhood. The poor guy died right on the operating table, They opened his brain to remove the tumor. And in the second picture, at this point his voice involuntarily trembled, shows the Yonce family with their little daughter, who would have celebrated her 11th birthday next year, but unfortunately she died this morning in a room at Randall Children's Hospital after surgery to remove a vital internal organ. Galbraith wanted to give his speech as formal a tone as possible, so as not to betray to Mr. Chief Inspector those feelings of empathy that he himself did not expect to feel in relation to the baby, whom he had known for at most one day. But Scaymore was too perceptive, and the inspector was overcome with mental turmoil. Galbraith interrupted himself. He suddenly felt that behind every word of the speech that he was now giving to his listener, there was almost physical pain, some kind of inexorable weight that had fallen on his heart. "So," said Mr. Chief Inspector in the ensuing silence, "the same person is behind both of these deaths, Dr. Baselard, who was worked in the hospital I mentioned." "I say was because this morning, just after the death of the child, the doctor packed his things and left for England, in order, I am sure, to avoid prosecution." Galbraith pulled out a pack of cigarettes from his pocket, pulled one out and flicked the lighter. "I don't expect him to return to America," he added, raising the cigarette to his mouth. After that, he went to the window and stopped, looking down at the street full of people. What was he thinking about at that moment? It is difficult to tell. Most likely, Galbraith was now remembering that he loves this life, loves Portland, its streets, and all its inhabitants. Or maybe he indulged in the great boredom, caused, of course, not by some idle thoughts, but just by gloomy experiences. He did not see what Mr. Chief Inspector Scaymore was doing at that moment, and he did not want to see. Having finished his speech, Galbraith seemed to have thrown off an invisible, but incredibly heavy burden that had previously weighed on his soul. Suddenly he heard an insinuating cough behind him. Having put out his cigarette, the inspector turned away from the window, realizing that this was an order to return to the desk. "You are aware, Galbraith," began Mr. Chief Inspector Scaymore. "You are clearly so concerned about the fate of this young lady that I feel obliged to send you to Jordan Thurlow." "Excuse me, but who that is?" Galbraith took a step closer and bowed his head, as if he was afraid to miss a word. "A person who is serving a sentence in Columbia River Correctional Institution. He was sentenced to 18 years in prison on suspicion of raping an underage girl who was the daughter of his neighbors. The court accused him of taking advantage of her mother's trust and forcing her to visit his house, where he put pressure on her." Listening to this story from Mr. Chief Inspector, Galbraith thought about how wonderful it would be if all the nasty things and sorrows that this world brought to people happened only to those who deserve it, and never to little, innocent children. But people are not divided into good and bad, he thought sadly. Meanwhile, Scaymore continued. Before his arrest, Mr. Thurlow, according to the victim's parents, abused her at his friend's apartment. In general, it is worth noting that the girl had a very emotional father. He was ready to literally do anything to put both men behind bars, but the court ruled that Jordan's friend was not proven. "Well," said Galbraith when Scaymore finished his speech. "And what do you suggest I do?" "Ride to Columbia River Correctional Institution and ask to have an audience with this prisoner. As far as I know, he's actually not a bad guy at all, but the power of public reprimand." "What will I get out of this?" Out of excitement, Galbraith interrupted the Mr. Chief Inspector. "That it depends only on you, Galbraith," he answered quietly. "Maybe peace of mind, or maybe a thirst for action. Either way, Thurlow's words will bring clarity to your thoughts." Galbraith involuntarily sank into a chair. He did not dare take these words of Mr. Chief Inspector at face value, but some part of his soul understood that, unfortunately, this was true. "I don't undertake to decide what you need, I can only say how I imagine your further tactic," Scaymore continued. "You want to go all the way and destroy that person, right?" "Sorry, did you really?" Galbraith wanted to ask again, but Scaymore raised his hand. "This is a figurative expression, as if consoling his listener," he said. "Because no one is going to bring this matter to the complete destruction of the suspect. We are policemen, not executioners. So what should I do right now?" Galbraith began to lose patience. "Go there," Mr. Chief Inspector said with importance. With these words, he put on his glasses and pushed a thick stack of papers towards him, making it clear to his interlocutor that he was free. It is possible that Mr. Chief Inspector intended to add farewell to this, but then 4 people in civilian clothes burst into the office, among whom Galbraith recognized the same gray-haired man in a coat who was talking with the young Sergeant Sausher. The inspector had no choice but to leave the Scaymores' office and head towards the exit of the police department. Going out into the corridor and closing the door behind him, Galbraith heard 4 Portuguese begin to loudly shout out some phrases in their native language, clearly trying to demonstrate Mr. Chief Inspector how much their case required the immediate intervention of the American police. Only when he reached the stairs leading to the first floor did he stop hearing their furious screams and calmly began to go down. Once on the first floor, the inspector hesitated a little, remembering the name of the colony that Scaymore had told him, and then he decisively pushed the door and went out into the sunlit street.